Welcome to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast with Ron and Kristin, where leadership meets entertainment. This podcast features stories with names and certain aspects that have been changed to keep submissions private. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast. On this episode, we are going to talk about different generations at work. Ron, there were strong feelings on this one, and our Facebook group was quite active when posed the questions about generations. There seems to be very different points of view. Have we gaslit one generation, and have we created a self-fulfilling prophecy by doing so?
Yeah, I think we've got to unpack this. You're right. The Facebook group is very active. I just literally got back from conducting training in Texas, and I talked to people, and there's strong opinions across the board about the different generations. So it definitely warranted this podcast for sure.
Yeah.
So before we go too far, I do want to get into the Facebook, some of the comments that we got. But let's lay a quick foundation so people understand who we're talking about, and then I know you're going to delve a little deeper on that. So the silent generation, that's 1925 to 45, we're probably not going to talk about them as much. They're not as active in the workplace at this point. But when you get down to baby boomers, or as my daughters like to call it, boomers, that's 46 to 64. Generation X, we're talking about born between 65 and 80. Millennials, 81 to 2000. Generation Z, 2001 to 2020. And Kristin, I would like to say that these have changed over the years, and this is what experts say. It doesn't mean, certainly we're not grouping everyone together, but when we are talking for the purposes of this podcast, when we do say millennials, we're talking about 1981 to 2000. And Kristin taught me a new term that we'll get into as well.
Yeah, microgeneration.
A little subgroup in there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I know we're going to share a few listener submissions with you in just a minute here, but this topic is so controversial that it really warrants some inquiries into the truths and myths and stereotypes. We all love to stereotype at times, even though we might not necessarily realize we're doing it. And I think it's important. I joined an employee resource group at one of the banks I worked at. So ERGs, we've talked about those before. And it was the intergenerational group. And we met monthly, and it was folks from across the company nationwide. So when we met, we just talked about how to work and be successful in interacting with different generations. And that was really important. It was not only to be able to work well with clients, but to work well with leadership in different generations. So that was a really interesting group that I was part of. But when we fundamentally can't relate to someone due to generational gaps, we often resort to stereotypes. Let's be honest with ourselves. And we blame solvable problems on each other instead of working to understand and value the differences that distance us. So our job performance and productivity are going to be negatively impacted by this as a result. So I want to talk about, there's a professor out there, Megan Gerhardt, and she has a great article that we both read when we were researching for this episode. She's the director of leadership development at Miami University's Farmer School of Business and the author of Gentelligence, which I love that. So she says the following, and Ron, I'll read this, and if you want to go into our listener submissions, the first thing to talk about is she says to challenge the existing stereotypes. And for the first time in modern history, there are 5 generations in the workforce. I don't know, let's be honest, how many silent generation folks are actually still active in the workforce and Kristin, really even alive?
We did. This is interesting. We did get one submission where someone said she managed someone age 20, I think it was 20, and someone age 80 working in the same place. How cool is that?
It is really cool. All right. So so there are some, because that era, if you think about it, it's 1925 to 1945. 45 is when World War II ended. So you really are getting a different mindset at that age. So that's pretty rad, actually. But before I dive too deep, let's share some of those submissions because I think those are very valuable to hear.
Yeah, and I have to pick on myself, but maybe I was trying to stir up some controversy the way I asked the question. But I think, Kristin, one of the things that we're talking about is maybe the best way to handle this situation is to stop talking about it. It's the same thing I've said, and you've said about race and other things when you said we stereotype people. Maybe we need to stop talking about it.
Right.
Let's consider this podcast. It's going to end the whole discussion forever across the world.
Yes.
Here's the question. This is me asking this question. Do you think the younger generation, Gen Z, works as hard as some of the other groups? If you have any stories, we want to hear them. People had stories.
Oh, I'm sure.
So we did get some people just saying they were glad that we were delving into this, and some short answers like no, basically saying that Gen Z does not work as hard. Then it started picking up pace a little bit. We had someone, and by the way, this is someone that's, I think, about a millennial age group. I think the younger generation thinks everything should be handed to them. They're not like back when our fathers were working and had to work hard. So basically, it's implying Gen Z doesn't work hard. And by the way, we know there's outliers on anything we talk about. Of course, you've got people that don't work hard, but we are trying to bring the balance here and bring some solutions. Someone else said no. Now, this post came from someone in the Gen Z age group, and I think it's very interesting. It says this: I think the older generation is way too obsessed and focused on talking about Gen Z and their work ethic. We aren't paid enough to live as the older generation was. Also, I believe the older generation didn't complain about them and took the initiative. If the older generation didn't complain about them and took the initiative to lead them when they're younger, they wouldn't be so focused on being so critical. I thought that was a great point.
Shots fired.
Shots fired. And I do want to make the observation, if you look at, and listen, it's just the way things were, but if you look in the 1950s, predominantly the father worked, the mother was at home. They had an average of 3 children, 3 to 5, I think it was, and they would actually have a car, have a home, pay for their children's education, summer camps, all the things that families did. So obviously that income ratio to the family was higher.
Right.
And if you look at Gen Z and you look at the current cost of living, it's very challenging for them to be optimistic, and they are not as optimistic as many other groups because of that. And of course, the world's a little screwed up right now. And I have talked to several people, Gen Z, and we did the COVID interviews with Gen Z.
Right.
And it was a little bleak. And that's when, Kristin, you saw me, I became a lot more empathetic or sympathetic to Gen Z than I was before. I've made tons of statements before, like, and I think we should note, and Chris and I talked about this before we started recording. If you think about it, I'm talking about the average person. Usually we only interact with Gen Z in restaurants, food and bev, or maybe in a grocery store or cashier situation. So I did have the opportunity, we'll talk about it more, to talk to some more professional categories where Gen Z is involved with, like college degrees and things like that. And it opened my eyes quite a bit. This one we will just go ahead and mention by name, since this was our administrator, Cassie Roop. She says, boy, does the world need more good, or this is me responding to her, I'm sorry. She said, I think it depends on the parents that raise them. I've tried to instill good work ethic and morals in my kids at a young age. Now my oldest works at my company, and I get so many compliments from people of how great he is. He's 15. And I responded, of course, saying that, and this is one of the conclusions Kristin and I came to, it's still about, in 1950 and in 2023, it's about parenting. It's about the social influences that people have. And I think we're going to see that more and more. But I'm going to read just a couple of others. This, again, is someone in more of the Gen X, I think, group. No, they feel everything should just be handed to them because they want it. This one says, this is someone teetering in that Gen Z age group. This is a good topic. I've always been the youngest person where I worked and sometimes felt super belittled and treated like a child. Interested to hear different perspectives. This one says, no, they are way more privileged and think that hard work is for old people. This one says, based on my experience, they have absolutely no idea what work or loyalty even means. So, and then the Gen Z person that posted came back and responded. So, Kristin, we've started a war on Facebook here.
Yeah, I know. I'm still 50-50. I do think we have to put ourselves in their shoes and understand really what they're going through and the challenges that they are up against. But at the same time, because of all these challenges, there definitely are personality traits that are going to show up in the workplace. And you know what's funny? My mom shared with me the other day, she's recently retired from her second career, but she was a leader. And I know she asked one of her Gen Z employees to literally write a letter to a customer. There was some reason for it, but he didn't know how to address an envelope. And she was dumbfounded. Like she couldn't even believe. She had to teach him, and he's in his mid-20s, how to address an envelope. And you talk about parenting. I think that if I think about, okay, my kids are much younger than him. They know how to address an envelope because I have made sure that they write thank you cards to family members after receiving a Christmas or birthday present. And I have them address the envelope because it makes it that much more special. And it's also having personal responsibility, right? And so clearly this kid had never been taught that. And so it has a lot to do with parenting. And so it's not that every Gen Z person doesn't know how to address an envelope, but someone like my mom, for instance, is going to go, my gosh, Gen Z, good Lord, you don't even know how to address an envelope, right?
Yeah,
and so,
right.
And my mom's a boomer. So it is easy to paint them all with one brush. But we do have to piecemeal it out a little bit and focus on the individual.
Yeah.
I don't know if you had anything on that before I moved on.
There's more comments, but I don't think they bring any additional value. Let's do this.
Yeah.
I do want to read one more because it was pretty well written. This was Dougie Wyman. And when we mention names, it's because people are okay with it. If people want to submit things anonymously, we'll do that. This person is responding to the Gen Z comments. Not all young people in work industry are alike. A lot of younger people think that you just do your job and you should get paid as much or more than someone who is older. The learning curve is much different in today's generation. It takes most young people longer to realize that hard work is only 25% of what makes you employable. I do feel bad, though, that the economy has been pushed so far to the edge that the value of a dollar almost doesn't pay for hardly anything. But young people keep voting for old people or think voting is not necessary to keep strong infrastructure going. Nope.
Right.
It basically just says, they elect the same people and then complain.
Yes.
We certainly see that unfold all the time. I wanted to say one last thing when you were mentioning I want us to go from family. I think we all agree the importance of family and good parenting, but there's managers who are listening or supervisors who the reality is the people did not have good parenting, so now they're stuck with these individuals. And what we have to understand is, just like in your mom's situation, you see someone can't address an envelope. We can complain or we can teach them to address an envelope.
Right.
So I think
she did both.
Yes, I'm sure. I think what people have to do is understand that mentoring will have to be intensified in those situations. And I'm going to talk about a little formula I developed in a few minutes. But go ahead, Kristin.
Yeah, no, I really like that. And I wanted to talk just real quick this is not part of what I planned on discussing, but one of the teams I managed, we had an individual who we were writing client letters, like just thank you cards, right? This is in retail banking. And his handwriting was, let's just say, not at the level where you would want to send a letter to a client with his handwriting. And so we had that team environment where we kind of gave each other a hard time. We all got along really well. And we were giving him a hard time, like, we're not sending that out, right? And then he shared with us that he had some type of learning disability where he was very, very intelligent, but brain to hand, there was something that made it very difficult to write. And there was a disconnect somewhere. And the cool thing is we immediately were like, let's work on this. One of my employees started working with him every day on handwriting. Of course, she had gone to school to be a teacher, and she was so excited to use some of her skills. And he was very open to it. And it's wild because he didn't have an upbringing where he had a lot of focus. I remember him sharing he didn't even have bed sheets. That just
Wow.
His parents didn't spend time on him. And our team became family in a sense to him. And so we have this employee who's teaching and working with him every single day on his handwriting, and it improved, and he felt so great about it. And so I do think that taking a minute to, and he was younger, but taking a minute to actually put some energy into a gap that you've identified. You have to have a willing participant though. So if you have someone that is closed off to being taught, that wouldn't have played out that well. But that was a really cool moment to experience where you can take a gap and help bridge it as a team.
You know, Kristin, in the leadership programs that we provide, we're talking about we have to, in today's world, you move from command and control to coaching.
Right.
And it's that constant feedback. And there's nothing that we've researched that can't be rectified with proper training, coaching, management. Of course, there's always people you got to coach out, as you've
Right.
said many times. We know that.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, we have to jump in there, work as a team, get people up to speed if they've got the attitude to do it. So I talked about these categories that we placed on these age groups. So Kristin, why don't you tell us a little
Okay, I
more
can
about
dive in
that?
a little more.
Yeah.
The silent generation, as we mentioned, not very many of those folks are in the workforce anymore. Sounds like yet an outlier there at that meeting. But those are the World War II. They just lived through World War II. So very different mentality there. Baby boomers, you've probably heard the term, okay, boomer. I think that's so funny. It's all over the internet. And that's 1946 to 1964. They are collaborative but adverse to change. That would be my parents. It's the Vietnam War era. I think that's interesting there. We have Gen X, which is 65 to 80. Now, this one's interesting. They're the work hard, play hard generation. They are good problem solvers. And the problem solving skills came from, this is really that first latchkey generation, the latchkey kids. And that's where they really raised themselves. Both parents were working. Many households at that time, it was the first time that both parents were going to be working. So they were coming home from school, and they called that the latchkey kids. They came home and they were on their own, and good problem solvers because of that. And then we move into, well, I'm going to share the micro generation that I fall into. This is the Oregon Trail generation. And yes, it exists. This is the end of the 70s, the early 80s. And the way to describe this is if you had a weekly computer lab, like your first interaction with a computer was at school in your weekly computer lab, and you couldn't wait to go in there, and the Oregon Trail game was on the screen, you're part of the Oregon Trail generation. My husband and I both fall into this, 1979, and I'm 1981. And that was my first experience with computers, was playing the Oregon Trail. It just happens I live in Oregon. But that was played nationwide, and a lot of people had that same experience. And the cool thing about this micro generation is we experienced life before technology and the excitement of when it first came out. And now we're very accustomed to it, but we were able to experience life. Like I remember when I first got a cell phone, I dropped it in my ex-boyfriend's couch, his parents' house, and I couldn't find it. I couldn't dig it out, and I didn't care. I left it there literally. They had those recliner couch chairs that are like a really heavy and a total pain. It was there for like a month before we got it out. I just didn't care. And now I'm like, oh my gosh, it's like everywhere I go, just like everyone else. So very, very different times. Gen X, yeah, work hard, play hard, went into that. Millennials, motivated by creative work. They're the teaching generation. I just shared a perfect example of what a teaching generation would look like. It's collaboration over the hierarchy. And they really want a manager they can connect with. And then we have Gen Z, which is really progressive, but considered to be disloyal. And not in a negative. I feel like disloyalty, that can also mean they're not going to stay with the company for 20 years for no reason. They're going to go where they can be paid the most, where they can advance, and they have the ability because of everything that you can find online today. Glassdoor, for example, you can go on and see what people make and what they feel about the company, and there's just so much information out there. So the disloyalty would come from knowledge, in my opinion. What are your thoughts on that, Ron?
I do think that's true, but I still stick with people leave managers, more than companies. But what we have to consider is many of these people are in college and they are planning a different career. So they're taking a lot of jobs that are just placeholders in their lives. But I did read that the average Gen Z will change jobs 8 times before they reach one of the other age groups that we would say. And people jumped around a little bit, the older generations, but as we get into boomers and silent generation, man, they would stick with a company forever. So as we're going to, we always try to be solution-minded. So let's start moving in that direction, Kristin. What's the first thing we need to maybe stop doing that we've already touched on?
Well, the first thing that we should do is challenge stereotypes. So for the first time in modern history, there are 5 generations in the workforce, and we each exhibit unique personality traits and values. And so, for example, a recent college graduate who started their first job during the pandemic is going to be accustomed to remote setup, and they might put a high value on flexibility and prefer to communicate digitally. Where on the other hand, someone who entered the workforce in 2008 during the recession might value job security and routine and prefer to work in a predictable 9-to-5 schedule 5 days a week. So back to Gerhardt, she said that we should avoid making assumptions about people solely based on their age, and that there is value in educating ourselves on the realities that different generations have faced throughout their careers, and understanding that these nuisances, they're essential to accepting one another, and is even more important for those in managerial roles and those who strive to be leaders one day, that they understand this. Ron, what are your thoughts on that?
And the bottom line is it goes back to coaching. It goes back to training. And I developed a little guide that I think helps companies ease up a little bit and not be so stressed about generations. I think if you sit around and talk, I heard some people the other day like, we're losing institutional knowledge. But you got to convey that institutional knowledge. You have to train people. So I came up with a little 80-10-10 principle. And number one, 80% of the time people are focused on the work. If someone's working a cash register, 80% of the time they're on that cash register. Another 10 is lunch breaks and things like that. So really managers need to focus on that 10% when they're interacting and training and onboarding. And if they will put their focus on that 10% and quit fretting over the other aspects, we can get people trained and up to the next level. And the beauty is, one of the best ways to connect, and I'm going to read an excerpt from my book, is to team people up, share information, talk. So I think that this is doable. It's going to take some very strategic effort, but I think it's doable. The next thing that Chris and I put together is communicate your preferences openly. We laugh. Chris and I consider ourselves transgenerational. My daughters laugh because I prefer text messaging, but a lot of when I was coming up through the workforce, my age group, emails. You emailed everything. But I would much rather have a text. unless it's something that I needed to memorialize or maybe have a big attachment or
Right.
something like that. So the key that managers should do is talk to individuals. Don't put them in a class. Don't put them in a group. Just say, how do you prefer to be communicated with? And if you are listening to this and you're wanting a promotion or you're having trouble at work, maybe you need to talk to your manager. Maybe you're wasting too much time. I remember someone would always call meetings and want to talk, and they gave enough information it could have been on a sticky note. So people communicate differently, and maybe someone does prefer. And if you are Gen Z and you're working for someone who prefers emails, then you just got to email.
Right.
You might be able to influence them, but there's some things we just have to give in for the good of the agency or the company.
Right.
But good communication is the way to start. That's what keeps us going. What's your thoughts?
Well, it's funny. As you were talking about this, I started thinking about, I had an employee once who was my banker, and he didn't like, he definitely was a different generation than I. He was older. And he didn't like when I would instant message him, because you have like internal chat where you can let somebody know
I remember
what's
it
going
well.
on. Oh my goodness. I love that. Like I thrive. That's like text message, but for work. And so I would message him. We just say, I pinged him, right? And let him know he had a client waiting or yada, yada. But he was like, that is so distracting to me. It really bugs me. Can you please write it on a sticky note and slap it on my desk? So for me, that was very clunky and awkward, especially if he's currently with a client. So I did that for a little while, and then I realized it just seemed unprofessional when you have a client sitting there to slap a sticky note on his desk. So we had to have a discussion and say, okay, I tried your way. Here are the reasons I don't think that's most effective. I'm going to need you to work with me on this one.
So you instant messaged him to tell him that?
No, that was an in-person.
Oh, okay. Just wondering.
Conference room conversation. Like, this isn't
You should have put it
gonna
on a
work
sticky
out.
note, slapped it on him, and
Should
said,
have.
"This isn't
That would have
working."
been really funny. This isn't working. We're going back to pinging. But yeah, so it is different. I think the most important takeaway from that is that he was open with me. That was annoying him. And I gave it a shot. I tried doing it his way. It didn't work from a professionalism standpoint. But I think we both listened to each other, and that's important. You have to be able to hear both sides. When I was doing the sticky note thing to appease him, let's just say, I knew from the beginning it was not a successful, it wasn't the right thing. It seemed unprofessional. But sometimes to get somebody's buy-in, you need to go in their direction.
That's a good point.
I think that's as much as it was painful for me, because I knew it was not a winning plan.
Yeah.
I did it. So the other thing is we need to respect boundaries. So there's going to be a wider representation of age groups at work, and this has introduced new beliefs and values into the office. So taboo topics of the past, like diversity and inclusion, mental health, gender roles, they're becoming widely discussed in professional settings, just like an individual's race, ethnicity, gender, sex, sexual orientation, religion, disability, class, personality, and educational background. That will now impact how comfortable they are talking about certain topics at work. So will their age and their upbringing. Bringing Gerhardt up again, she explained that research has shown younger generations tend to be more progressive about social issues, as well as more comfortable talking about topics that were previously considered taboo in the workplace. So she also said the willingness of younger employees to accept and normalize the discussion of these important topics is resulting in a decrease in the stigma that has traditionally surrounded talking about them at work. So it's also important to keep in mind how your employees feel about certain topics. It's going to vary from employee to employee, not just because of their age or because they fall into one of these categories. It needs to be individualized. And it's not necessary for every person to agree, but it is important for them to understand why the organization places a high value on the issues being discussed. Specifically, when it comes to race and gender, on one social trend is reporting that in 2020, it shows that there are some measurable patterns around beliefs different generations hold in the United States. But when it comes to race relations, the report says that Gen Zers and millennials are about equally likely to say that Black people are treated less fairly than white people in this country. So roughly 2/3 of Gen Zers and millennials say this is compared with about half of Gen Xers and boomers, and shares, and smaller shares, of course, among the silent generation. So basically, in a nutshell, Ron, you know I'm going to go there. They're a product of the environment. These beliefs are a product of the environment. And I'm not just talking about home life. I'm talking about what they're seeing on the news, on social media, what they're being told by different political parties. I mean, let's dive into that a little bit. We're seeing pronouns. Now, is that because they feel like their position has changed on that? Or is it because someone feels guilty if they don't put their pronouns, because that is what they're being told to do? If you want to fit in, if you want to make people feel comfortable, if you don't want to marginalize, you must put your pronouns in your email signature, on your LinkedIn profile, on your social media profiles. I believe it's so they feel like they're not a bad person. I don't know what your thoughts are, Ron.
Well, it's obviously mixed, but I think every decade you have a new, probably a trend or a new belief system that's introduced. And we certainly, I believe in the past 5 years, there's been more of a change, a paradigm shift across the board on these gender issues, on trans issues, on all these things. And people are bombarded. So there's no doubt there's some people who buy in, they believe it, but absolutely, I've talked to people who are afraid to speak up or express a varying opinion. And of course, we could go on, but the point we want to make is we want to help leaders. And what we are sharing with you is a reality. You may loathe some of these topics. That does not change the belief system of the person who's new to that position and you're working with them. So you got to find ways to work together. And as relationships build, mentorships build, I'm not saying that it's appropriate in work, but there may be times where these discussions can come up and you can find out why they believe what they believe, because knowledge is power when you're managing someone. But there are ways to work together, but the reality is, and just like Kristin's touching on here, there's going to be topics that you may vehemently disagree. And we've said this about political issues and everything else. There's no reason you should not be able to work with someone, even if you have different philosophies. Right. You find ways to narrow the gap and you carry on. But anyway, we can go on that. Let's move. Do you have anything else, Kristin?
No. I'm gonna zip it from on that topic. It's best I do that. Let's talk about not playing favorites.
Yes. I do think that's difficult. I remember it because I saw it play out in the workplace. You tend generally now to have more in common with your age group because you have the same historical references. You have the same TV shows that you watch.
Yep.
If you quizzed each other, you're going to know more. So that's generally speaking. But what happens is if you're a leader and you want to influence someone, you can't be playing favoritism with those people that agree with you more. You
Right.
have to get to know everyone. And I did work hard at that. Now, if I had favorites, I probably enjoyed working with the younger people more than some of the people who are more, I guess, settled in and felt a sense of entitlement or, we own this place kind of thing. So I enjoyed it. And I think, Kristin, if people can work hard, be very focused, deal with reality, understand, we talked about this at work in that 80-10-10 principle that I introduced, there's these 80% you're working and you're focused on things. Now, there may be some variations on how you get work done, but you can work together on that. And then, the other 10 and 10, when you've got that 10% with someone, you have to be inquisitive. You have to find out what they prefer and all those type things. But this is what we have to realize. After hours, after work, people vary. They really do. And we see that all the time, from the extracurricular activities, the hobbies, belief systems. They're really more prevalent after work, and that's why I don't want leaders to stress out. Focus on that 10% time you get with them, make the most of it. But yes, they're going to be different from you. The conversations in the break room are going to be different because they're doing different things. So again, we try to be solution-minded. So don't play favorites. Try to get to know each individual, and I think you can make a lot more progress. So, Kristin, I'm going to do something that I have never done. I've been on numerous podcasts. I've talked about the book excerpts, but I've never read from the book.
So I'm excited.
Well, this isn't my most exciting story, but I do think I put a lot of research into this and was able to come up with this, someone who shared the story, and it really helped. So here we go. This is chapter 21, Generational Conflict. I do an introduction. I won't do that because we've covered a lot of that now. But there's a subheading called the generational dilemma. Here we go. Michelle supervised several employees at a manufacturing company. Among the employees were a 28-year-old woman named Samantha and a 51-year-old man named Maurice. This relationship resulted in an interesting dynamic. While both were seemingly nice people, they had trouble working together. One day, Samantha approached Michelle and showed her an app that streamlined production count. Samantha wanted Michelle to approve its purchase. Michelle loved the app and approved the purchase immediately. Not long after Samantha had the app installed, she asked to meet with Michelle again. During the meeting, Samantha said that Maurice wasn't open to downloading the app on his company phone and didn't believe it would expedite production count. Is this starting to sound familiar?
Oh, yeah.
Michelle decided to talk with Maurice. When questioned, Maurice told her that there was no need for the app and that Samantha spent too much time on her cell phone. He believed she was always looking for shortcuts to avoid hard work. He also asserted that she lacked customer service skills. This presented quite the challenge for Michelle. Michelle, again, is the manager. Maurice had been with the company for 18 years. Samantha had already worked for three similar companies, but had been with this manufacturer for just 10 months. Not only did they approach work differently, they also came from different cultural backgrounds. Samantha had a master's degree, and Maurice was former military with a high school education. Man, it seems that these two have a lot of differences. By the way, I get pulled into this dilemma. I get to be the hero of the story here.
Oh.
Michelle believed that Samantha had brought several good ideas to the company, but she also admired Maurice's work ethic, his ability to communicate, and his years of service. As Michelle began to seek middle ground, she tried to get to the root of the problem. While Samantha was more technologically savvy, Michelle observed that Maurice seemed to have a better rapport with commercial buyers. Both were hard workers, and Maurice had no problem working overtime. To the contrary, Samantha would try to find a way to complete tasks more efficiently, as she believed overtime was unnecessary. Maurice approached problem solving in a traditional way. He would analyze the problem, study some literature, talk with some experts. On the other hand, Samantha would seek the answer online. These are just a few of the differences between the two. And I do remember when my daughters, I would be trying to fix something. They're both on YouTube. They're looking. By the way, I quit reading there. I threw in a little extra. Michelle met with Maurice and Samantha and discussed the issue. It seemed to go pretty well, but by the end of the week, the same problem resurfaced. Working out generational differences. This is subheading. Michelle called me asking for advice. The first thing I did was perform a wellness check on her. So we're going to skip that because she was stressed to the max over this situation.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So Michelle asked how she could promote this much-needed respect. I recommended that Maurice and Samantha develop a better understanding of each other's background and perspective. To that end, I suggested that Michelle invite them to lunch and be forthright about the reason to help them get to know each other a little bit better, which might improve their ability to work together and to increase productivity. Employees usually know when you have an ulterior motive, so be clear and honest from the get-go. Can you imagine if Michelle just said, hey, you two, let's go to lunch? That would have been so fake.
Yeah.
Michelle was a bit apprehensive about having such a meeting because she didn't know how she would guide the conversation. I told her to find out beforehand some things about Samantha and Maurice that Samantha and Maurice felt comfortable discussing. So anyway, I'm going to speed up a little bit, but she got into Maurice's military background, and then Samantha had some, interesting stories at college. Mm-hmm. The next step would be to have Maurice and Samantha work together on a special project. By the way, they had some fun time at lunch talking about college and military. Nice. The next step would be to have Maurice and Samantha work together on a special project and possibly do some cross-training with each other. Michelle would have to supervise these activities carefully until the two got more comfortable with each other. And Kristin, I've always said there is a place for micromanaging. We hate it, but there is a little time period when you have to do it.
Sometimes it's needed, yeah.
A few weeks later, Michelle said that the lunch and subsequent joint project had worked and had been a tremendous success. At lunch, each had stories the other found interesting. They even discussed the differences between baby boomers and millennials and developed some inside jokes at work. So I was very pleased when that happened. Now, I did put, as I was very honest in my book, I put a caveat that this stuff doesn't always work out, and sometimes you have to manage and take personnel action, because I had two employees that couldn't work together, and I had to bring them in and read the riot act. But that is a possible scenario that sometimes if you get to know someone and you start to bond and you start to care for each other, you will work around those idiosyncrasies. You're willing to try new things. And I think that's what we're talking about, Kristin. How would you sum up what we've discussed? What's your overall thoughts?
Yeah, well, my overall, I would say we really should challenge ourselves to stop focusing on the generation and focus on the individual. And I don't feel like if somebody lacks in a certain area, we shouldn't be okay with it because of what generation they fall into. And this could be on any end, right? I think there's a job at hand. We should do our best to understand someone's background, but then also that doesn't mean it's an excuse or a reason not to perform. So really focusing on the individual's performance and how they are at work, that is going to be most important. Understand, but also understand the background, because that is what makes somebody who they are. But then also we just need to focus on them as an individual. Couldn't stress that enough.
Very well said. I don't think I can add a lot to that. I would just encourage managers to get to know, to take the extra steps. You may have to work a little harder, but you can narrow that gap. We're optimists here.
Yeah, hey, we're bridging the gap, right?
Yes. Kristin, this was fun. This is a great conversation. I hope we can keep it going. Our Facebook group and different people. And if you disagree with us, that's okay. You can put that in the comments as well. Just don't call Kristin really bad names. Don't call me bad names.
Exactly.
And Kristin, well, we got something else exciting. Yeah. Our planner will be up soon.
Yes,
by the next episode, we should have specific details. So I'm really excited about that.
We've moved on to design. The design's my favorite part.
Yeah.
It's going to be exciting. Excellent.
All right. Be the leader you're meant to be.
We'll see you next week.
The Dirty Side of Leadership podcast is brought to you by Forward Operations. If you'd like to book Ron or Kristin for speaking events, training, or executive coaching, visit forwardoperations.com. Be the leader you're meant to be.